The clock on the wall of the obsidian room did not chime. For such a sound would be an intrusion upon the curated silence Do-hyun paid so dearly to maintain. Instead, the golden hand simply slipped past the Roman numeral for 10, marking the precise start of his Thursday ritual. This was the only hour of the week where the machinery of the city's most formidable criminal empire was allowed to idle. Do-hyun sat in the corner booth, a space that remained permanently vacant even when the restaurant was at its capacity, reserved for a man who owned the building but chose to sit in it like a ghost. He was 37 years old, possessing a light tan complexion that looked smooth against the sharp, disciplined lines of his jet-black hair. His tailored black suit jacket was draped perfectly over his frame, yet he felt the weight of it more heavily on Thursdays than on any other night. This was his sanctuary, a world designed in nothing but dark tones and hushed whispers where million-dollar deals were usually sealed with a single nod of his head. The staff moved around him with the practiced grace of shadows, their footsteps muffled by the thick, plush carpeting. They knew the rules without needing to be reminded. Do not approach unless signaled, do not refill the water until it is exactly half empty, and under no circumstances should anyone else be seated within a 2-booth radius. This was not born of ego, but of a necessity for a vacuum in a life otherwise filled with the constant, deafening noise of loyalty and betrayal. Do-hyun reached out, his fingers brushing the cool condensation on the first of 2 whiskeys he would permit himself tonight. This first glass marked the beginning of his presence, the moment he stopped looking at the ledger of his life and started looking at the room. He took a slow, measured sip, the amber liquid burning with a familiar, grounding heat. His eyes, intense and focused, scanned the perimeter not for threats. His security was invisible but absolute, but for the small details that others missed. He noticed the slight wobble in a waiter's step, the way the light caught the dust motes dancing in the air, and the rhythmic, quiet scrubbing of the cleaning staff in the far corridor. Precision was the only religion Do-hyun practiced. His life was a series of controlled distances, a complex map of who was allowed within arm's reach and who was kept at the horizon. Even his appearance reflected this rigidity. The crisp white dress shirt was slightly open at the collar, a calculated choice to appear relaxed, though his posture remained as upright and unyielding as a soldier's. On his wrist, a gold luxury watch caught the dim light, a symbol of wealth that he rarely looked at for the time, using it instead as an anchor to the physical world. Beneath that sleeve, hidden from the casual observer, was the neck tattoo that climbed toward his jawline, a jagged remnant of a younger, bloodier version of himself. He was a man who had built his empire through blood. Yet tonight, he wanted nothing more than the silence of the obsidian walls. He looked toward the kitchen, offering a short, nearly imperceptible nod to the head chef who peered through the order window. It was the only communication they would have, a silent acknowledgement of the meal that would never be ordered, but was always prepared and then discarded. A plate of simple mandu, his brother's favorite. The ritual's origin was a wound that refused to scar over. Thursday had been the night he and his brother ate together in a cramped basement apartment long before the suits were tailored and the whiskey was aged. They would split a single order of dumplings and talk about a future that only one of them would live to see. Now Do-hyun sat in a room that cost more than that entire apartment building. Yet the emptiness across the table felt twice as heavy. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, his thumb tracing the edge of a small, rectangular object. He did not pull it out. He never did. The photograph stayed tucked against his heart, a hidden image of 2 boys with dirt on their faces and hope in their eyes. To display it would be a weakness, and in his world, weakness was an invitation for an execution. Instead, he carried the memory as a private penance, a weight he chose to bear alone in the dark. He watched the old cleaning lady work near the entrance, her movements quiet and honest. She had been here for months, a silent fixture in his periphery. He appreciated her lack of greed. She never lingered too long, never tried to catch his eye for a larger tip, and never asked for anything but the wage she earned. He respected that brand of silence. When he left, he would leave a tip on the table that exceeded her weekly salary, but he would do it without a word, slipping the bills under the empty glass so the wind of his departure wouldn't blow them away. It was an act of cold charity, a way to balance the scales of a soul he knew was already tipped too far toward the dark. He shifted his weight, his sharp jawline tightening as he felt the familiar itch of restlessness. The 2 hours were his only tether to his humanity, but they were also a reminder of how much of it he had traded away for the crown he wore. As the first hour began to wane, Do-hyun signaled for the second whiskey. This glass would mark the end of his peace, the transition back into the man the city feared. He watched the amber liquid being poured, the golden luxury of it clashing with the pale, tired look of the woman he noticed standing near the service door. She wasn't the usual cleaning lady. This woman was younger, in her late 20s, wearing a worn gray hoodie that looked soft from too many washes. Her long, dark brown hair was slightly messy, falling loosely around a face that held a frantic, fragile hope. Do-hyun felt a ripple in the atmosphere of his ritual. The staff seemed to stiffen, sensing the breach in the protocol. The woman's eyes were wide and glossy, scanning the room with a desperation that didn't belong in a place this expensive. She was out of options. He could see it in the way her hands were tightly clasped together, as if she were trying to hold her entire life from falling apart between her fingers. He should have signaled his men to remove her. He should have turned his gaze back to the obsidian depths of his drink and ignored the intrusion. But there was something in the way she leaned forward, her brows raised with a fear that was so raw it bypassed his defenses. She wasn't looking for a handout. She was looking for a miracle. Do-hyun sat perfectly still, his controlled posture giving nothing away, but his curiosity, a trait he usually suppressed, began to stir. He was a man used to lies and outstretched hands, but this woman looked as though she were standing on the edge of a cliff, and he was the only thing between her and the fall. The silence of the room grew heavy, the ritual interrupted by the arrival of a reality he usually spent millions to avoid. He didn't move as she began to approach the forbidden booth, her footsteps uneven and loud against the quiet he had bought. He simply watched, the ghost of his brother's memory fading as the living desperation of a mother took center stage in the darkest corner of his world. The transition between the first whiskey and the second was always the most dangerous part of the night, for it was when the barriers of the present began to thin, allowing the cold air of the past to bleed through the obsidian walls. Do-hyun stared into the amber depths of his glass, the liquid reflecting the dim, expensive lights of the restaurant, but his mind was elsewhere, trapped in a corridor 15 years younger, and a world away from this tailored luxury. He remembered the sterile, suffocating scent of floor wax and industrial disinfectant that defined the hospital hallway outside the ICU. A place where time did not move in minutes, but in the frantic, irregular rhythms of a failing heart. It was a corridor he had never truly left, a haunting geography that mapped the exact moment his soul had hardened into the stone it was today. At the center of that memory was Soo-min, his brother, who had been 2 years his junior, and the only person in the world who believed in Do-hyun's inherent goodness with an uncomplicated, blinding certainty. To Soo-min, Do-hyun wasn't the shadow in the alley or the rising enforcer for a fledgling syndicate. He was simply the older brother who shared his dumplings and promised that one day, they wouldn't have to hide from the rain. Soo-min's faith had been a heavy mantle, one that Do-hyun wore with a mixture of pride and terror, knowing even then that he was unworthy of such pure devotion. But the world had a cruel way of correcting such imbalances. The night it happened, Do-hyun hadn't been there to catch his brother when he collapsed from a condition no one knew existed. An acute lightning-fast failure of the heart that struck without warning or mercy. Instead, Do-hyun had been sitting in a cramped, windowless police interrogation room, his wrists chafed by steel and his temper rising against a detective who didn't care about justice, only leverage. The detective had held him on a flimsy technicality, a calculated move to squeeze information out of the man they already sensed was becoming a kingpin. He remembered the flickering fluorescent light of that room, the way the detective had smirked while ignoring Do-hyun's growing, instinctive unease. By the time Reed, his lieutenant and the only man who moved as fast as the shadows, had managed to pull the necessary strings and navigate the legal labyrinth to get him out, the clock had already run out. The drive to the hospital had been a blur of screeching tires and silent prayers, a desperate race against a finish line that had already been crossed. When Do-hyun finally reached that ICU corridor, the silence was different from the silence of the obsidian room. It was heavy, final, and thick with the taste of ash. He had arrived just in time to see the white sheet being pulled over a face that still looked like the boy who had laughed at his jokes just 24 hours prior. Soo-min was gone, lost to a silence that no amount of money or power could ever break. In that hollowed-out hallway, surrounded by the mechanical beeps of machines that no longer had a purpose, Do-hyun had made a promise. It was a vow whispered to a person who could no longer hear it, a commitment to a ghost that he would never again be in a position of helplessness. He had looked at his hands, the hands that had been cuffed while his world ended, and decided they would only ever hold the reins of power from that moment forward. The 15 years that followed were an exercise in controlled grief, a slow, methodical construction of an empire built on the rubble of his heartbreak. Every deal sealed, every rival neutralized, and every street corner claimed was a brick in the fortress he built to ensure that no detective, no law, and no circumstance could ever trap him again. He had ascended the throne of the city's underworld not out of greed, but out of a pathological need for autonomy. Yet, as he sat in his booth tonight, the gold watch on his wrist felt like another kind of shackle. The irony was a jagged pill he swallowed with every sip of whiskey. The very empire he had built to protect himself was the reason he had been in that interrogation room to begin with. His pursuit of power to protect Soo-min had been the exact thing that kept him from his brother's side when it mattered most. It was a circular trap of his own making, an unresolvable paradox that left him wealthy, feared, and utterly alone in a room of dark tones. He had become the ghost he once feared, a man who lived in the shadows of his own success, unable to move forward because his heart was still standing in that hospital corridor, waiting for a heartbeat that would never come. He had traded his humanity for a crown, only to find that the crown offered no warmth against the cold memory of his brother's last, lonely moments. The organization of his life, the staff who didn't speak, the booth no one touched, the 2 hours of mandated presence, was his way of honoring a brother who had loved the simple act of being together. Thursday was the night they were supposed to grow old. Now it was just the night Do-hyun allowed himself to feel the full weight of the silence. He adjusted the cuff of his shirt, his intense, focused eyes momentarily losing their sharp edge as he stared at the empty seat across from him. He could almost see Soo-min there, leaning over a plate of mandu, his eyes bright with some mundane story about his day. The phantom pain in Do-hyun's chest was the only thing that felt real in a world made of tailored suits and luxury watches. He was a man who had built a kingdom to escape his past, only to realize that every stone in his palace was etched with the name of the person he had failed. He took another sip of the whiskey, the second glass now half empty, signaling the approaching end of his ritual. The transition back into the Mafia Boss, the man whose name made grown men tremble, was beginning to take hold. His jaw tightened, the light stubble on his face catching the shadows as he composed himself. He was a master of masks, a man who could project calm while a storm raged within. But tonight, the mask felt thinner than usual. The presence of the woman in the gray hoodie, lurking near the periphery of his sanctuary, was a jarring reminder of the world outside his controlled vacuum. A world where people still had something to lose besides their pride. He looked at her, and for a fleeting, dangerous second he didn't see a stranger. He saw the same raw, frantic desperation he had carried into that hospital 15 years ago. The obsidian room felt smaller now, the dark tones pressing in on him like the walls of that interrogation room. He realized with a start that he had spent over a decade trying to buy his way out of that feeling of helplessness. Yet here he was, paralyzed by a memory and a request he hadn't even heard yet. He was a man who dealt in blood and betrayal. Yet the sight of a mother's clasped hands felt more threatening than a loaded gun. It was a breach of his peace, a violation of the Thursday silence he guarded so fiercely. He should have been angry. He should have felt the cold, calculating instinct to protect his territory rise up and crush the intrusion. Instead, he felt a strange, hollow echo of the promise he had made to Soo-min. A promise to be strong, to be the one who didn't let people fall. As he watched Elena step closer, her eyes glossy with a fragile hope that he knew was destined to be crushed by a city as cold as he was, Do-hyun felt a shift in the air. The whiskey no longer warmed him. The gold watch felt heavy. The corridor in his mind seemed to lengthen, stretching from the ICU to this very booth. He was the most powerful man in Chicago, a man who could command armies with a whisper, but in the face of a mother's simple, desperate need, He felt the old ghost of the helpless boy he used to be. The ritual was over. The silence was broken. And as the woman finally reached the edge of his table, her mouth opening to deliver the plea that would stun him, Do-hyun realized that for the first time in 15 years, he wasn't just a ghost. He was a man who might finally have a reason to stop running from the dark. The transition from the shadow of the service door to the edge of the obsidian booth felt like walking through a wall of ice. But for Elena, known only as Lucy to the few people who bothered to learn her name, the cold was nothing new. Her world was not built of tailored suits and amber whiskey, but of the rhythmic, soul-crushing hum of the laundromat's day shift and the lingering scent of old grease from the noodle shop where she spent her evenings. Every second of her life was a mathematical equation of survival, a constant, desperate tallying of what was left and what was owed. In her pocket, she carried the crumpled remains of her latest paycheck, exactly $287. A figure that mocked the looming $3,400 debt that sat on her chest like a physical weight. She had exactly 6 weeks until Ashley's next round of specialist appointments, 6 weeks to find a miracle in a city that traded only in silver and lead. It was a deadline that felt more like a death sentence, a countdown ticking away in the quiet moments between her two jobs when the exhaustion finally threatened to pull her under. Lucy's story was not one of grand tragedies or cinematic betrayals. It was a story of a slow, quiet erosion. The man who was supposed to be her partner, the father of her child, had not left with a slammed door or a violent outburst. Instead, he had vanished when Ashley was only 2 years old, leaving behind nothing but a brief, clinical text message and a forwarding address that led to a vacant lot. In some ways, the clinical nature of his departure was worse than a fight would have been. It left no narrative to cling to, no villainous act to make sense of the wreckage. It was simply an absence, a void where a foundation should have been, leaving Lucy to build a life out of thin air and sheer willpower. She had spent the last 2 years trying to fill that hole with love, but love did not pay for the medication that kept Ashley's breathing steady, and it certainly did not keep the wolves from the door when the first major medical crisis hit 8 months ago. That crisis was the reason she was standing here tonight, trembling in a gray hoodie that felt like a shroud. To save Ashley then, she had taken a loan from a man whose name was whispered in the same breath as curses, a man who dealt in high interest and broken bones. She had told herself it was a temporary measure, a bridge to get them across the water, but the interest had been eating her alive since the very first week. It was a predator that grew larger the more she fed it, a debt that would never be satisfied. 3 days ago, the collector had come to her door while Ashley was sleeping, his presence a dark stain on the cracked linoleum of her hallway. He hadn't raised his voice, and he hadn't touched her. But the way he looked at the small, colorful sneakers near the door had told Lucy everything she needed to know. She hadn't told a soul about that visit because there was simply no one to tell. No mother to call, no friend with a spare room, only the silent, terrifying realization that she was entirely on her own. At the center of this storm was Ashley, a serious-eyed 4-year-old who lived in a world of stuffed rabbits and faded coloring books. Ashley was the only thing Lucy had ever done that felt truly right, the only piece of beauty in a life that had become a series of transactions and compromises. The girl was small for her age, with a quiet intensity that suggested she understood far more about their struggle than a child ever should. She spent her days clutching a tattered plush rabbit named Barnaby, his fur matted from years of being held tight during the long nights when the fever came or the radiator failed. To Lucy, Ashley was not just a daughter. She was a reason to keep breathing when the weight of the $3,400 felt like it would crush her ribs. She was the most important thing Lucy had ever created, a fragile flame she was determined to shield from the wind, no matter how hard it blew. Tonight, however, the wind had become a hurricane. Lucy had been called into the club for an emergency cleaning shift, a rare chance for overtime she couldn't afford to refuse, but her usual sitter had disappeared without a word. She had been forced to bring Ashley with her, hiding the child in the small, cramped break room behind the kitchen, praying the manager wouldn't find her. But then the call had come, a message from the clinic saying they had a cancellation for the specialist Ashley needed to see, an appointment that would normally take months to secure. It was tonight in 1 hour, on the other side of the city. If she missed it, she might not get another chance until it was too late. She couldn't leave Ashley alone in the break room, and she couldn't take her across town while she was supposed to be working. She was trapped in the center of a nightmare, her mind racing through a list of names and numbers that all ended in a dial tone. That was when she had seen him. Do-hyun, the man they called the boss, sitting in his usual booth like a king in a cathedral of shadows. She had watched him for months, noticing the way the world seemed to stop when he entered the room. He was a man of immense, terrifying power, a man who could make things happen with a single word. To anyone else, he was a monster to be avoided, but to Lucy, in this moment of peak desperation, he looked like a fortress. She didn't see the suit or the gold watch. She saw a man who was never moved, a man who sat still while the world roared around him. She knew it was madness. She knew that approaching him was like walking into the cage of a lion and asking for a favor. But the image of the collector standing near Ashley's sneakers burned in her mind, and the sound of Ashley's shallow, wheezing breath from the break room drowned out the voice of her own survival instinct. As she moved closer to the obsidian booth, the $287 in her pocket felt like a weight of lead, a reminder of how little she had to offer in a place like this. She wasn't just carrying her child's future. She was carrying the accumulated weight of every unpaid bill, every skipped meal, and every moment of terror she had endured since the text message that changed her life. Her hands were clasped so tightly her knuckles were white, a silent prayer echoing in her head. She didn't want his money, not yet, though she needed it desperately. What she needed was the one thing he seemed to have in abundance. A presence so absolute that no one would dare disturb what he guarded. She needed a guardian for 60 minutes, a wall of stone to stand between her daughter and the world while she ran to save her child's life. The air around the booth grew thick with the scent of expensive whiskey and the silent, judging gaze of the invisible security men. Lucy didn't look at them. She kept her eyes locked on the back of the man's head, on the neat, slicked-back black hair, and the hint of the tattoo on his neck. Her heart was beating with a frantic, irregular rhythm, mirroring the one that had broken in that ICU corridor 15 years ago. Though she didn't know it. She was stepping into a world she didn't understand, driven by a love that was the only currency she had left. When she finally reached the edge of the table, she didn't see a mafia boss, she saw a last resort. She leaned forward, the worn fabric of her hoodie a sharp contrast to the polished surface of his world, and prepared to speak the words that would change both of their lives forever. The words felt heavy in her throat, a mixture of bile and hope. She wasn't asking for a boyfriend or a loan. She was asking for a piece of his soul, a moment of his time to watch over the only thing that made her life worth living. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the furrowed brow and the calm, alert eyes of a man who was used to controlling everything. She saw the whiskey glass in his hand, a symbol of a peace she had never known. And then, with a voice that trembled but did not break, she let out the plea that would echo in that dark room long after the night was over. She didn't know about Sumin or the hospital corridor, but in that moment, the mother who had nothing met the man who had everything, and the silence of the obsidian room was finally, irrevocably shattered. The night of the specialist's cancellation was a blurring of the lines between survival and madness, beginning with a phone call at 7:40 that severed Lucy's last thread of stability. Her babysitter's voice had been a distant, static-filled apology, a casualty of a flu that didn't care about the 6-week countdown, or the $3,400 debt looming over a 4-year-old's breathing. Lucy didn't have time to cry, she only had time to move. She scooped Ashley up, the tattered rabbit Barnaby tucked firmly under the girl's arm, and began the 3-block run in her worn work shoes, the soles clicking frantically against the damp pavement of the Gold Coast. Each step was a heartbeat of panic, a calculation of minutes versus miles. By the time she reached the heavy, dignified doors of the building housing the obsidian room, her lungs were burning with the same fire she feared for her daughter. She stood before the entrance, a ghost in a gray hoodie, looking at the elite world she usually only cleaned. She made the decision in the span of a single ragged breath. She would not miss this appointment, and she would not leave her child with a stranger, unless that stranger was the only man in Chicago whom no one would dare to touch. Lucy walked into the velvet silence of the lounge, her presence a jagged tear in the fabric of the room's expensive piece. She ignored the stiffening of the security detail and the confused glances of the staff, walking straight toward the corner booth where Do-hyun sat like a monolith of jet black hair and tailored discipline. When she reached the table, she didn't wait for permission. She sat down, the act itself a transgression that caused the very air in the room to turn cold. Do-hyun didn't flinch. He merely lowered his whiskey glass, his intense, focused eyes tracking her with a curiosity that held no aggression, only a profound, silent weight. Lucy didn't lead with a greeting. She leaned forward, her hands tightly clasped in a begging gesture, and delivered the request that stunned the room into a vacuum. "I have an hour to save her life," she whispered, her voice a fragile bridge across the table. "I have no one left to ask. Please just sit with her. 1 hour. No one will touch her if she is with you." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that fills a room until the walls themselves seem to ache. Do-hyun's furrowed brow was the only sign of the internal storm she had triggered, his gaze shifting from the desperate mother to the small, serious-eyed child standing beside her. Ashley didn't shrink away from the man with the neck tattoo and the cold gray eyes. Instead, she watched him with the level, piercing assessment she applied to all new adults, her small fingers twisting the ear of her rabbit. The Mafia Boss, a man who built an empire to avoid the helplessness of a hospital corridor, found himself pinned by the gaze of a 4-year-old. After a long, agonizing moment, Ashley tilted her head and delivered her verdict in a voice that was too quiet for the guards to hear, but loud enough to shatter Do-hyun's composure. "You look lonely." The impact of those 3 words was visible in the way Do-hyun's jaw tightened, a momentary lapse in his perfectly styled control. He didn't agree and he didn't refuse. He simply moved his arm, clearing a space on the obsidian table, as if inviting a new player into a high-stakes game. Lucy didn't wait for a verbal confirmation. She kissed Ashley's forehead, whispered a promise she prayed she could keep, and disappeared back into the night, leaving the most feared man in the city with a child who didn't know how to be afraid of him. The hour that followed was a sequence of events Do-hyun could not have calculated in any ledger. It began with a picture book Ashley pulled from her backpack, a worn story about a lost star that she shoved toward his tailored sleeve. Do-hyun, a man who sealed million-dollar deals with a nod, found himself navigating the treacherous waters of a mispronounced fairy tale. His voice, usually reserved for commands and cold negotiations, sounded foreign in his own ears as he read aloud, his tone stiff but oddly focused. Ashley sat beside him, her small frame a warm contrast to his rigid, upright posture. At one point, she pointed to a character and spoke 2 words in her own private language, a soft, rhythmic sound that Lucy had once explained meant safe home. Do-hyun repeated them, the syllables feeling heavy and strange on his tongue, a bridge to a world he had abandoned 15 years ago in a sterile ICU hallway. As the minutes ticked past on his gold luxury watch, the weight he had been carrying began to shift. Ashley, exhausted by the day's stress and the rhythm of his low voice, eventually leaned her head against his suit jacket. Her breathing slowed into the deep, rhythmic cadence of sleep, and Do-hyun felt the weight of her against an arm that had not held anything smaller than a weapon or a bottle in over a decade. He sat perfectly still, his controlled posture now serving a new purpose, ensuring he didn't wake the sleeping child. The guards watched from the shadows, their expressions a mixture of awe and terror, as the man who ruled through blood became a silent anchor for a girl who owned nothing but a tattered rabbit. The 1 hour was a revelation of everything he had lost, and everything he was currently protecting with his wall of darkness. He looked down at the top of Ashley's head, noticing how small she was against the vast, dark tones of his empire. For the first time since Sumin's heart had stopped, the corridor in his mind didn't feel quite so long. He wasn't the ghost of a grieving brother in this moment. He was simply a man sitting in a booth, guarding a light he hadn't realized he was looking for. When the heavy doors finally swung open again, Lucy returned. She was breathless, her pale face flushed with a mixture of exertion and a brand of joy he had never seen in the obsidian room. She saw them before they saw her. The Mafia Boss frozen in place, a sleeping child tucked against his side. She approached the table with a lightness that suggested the $3,400 weight had finally shifted, if only by an inch. "I got it," she whispered, her eyes glossy with tears that didn't fall. "The job, the specialist, she's going to be okay." Do-hyun didn't smile, but he did something more significant. He carefully shifted his arm to allow her to take the child, his movements practiced and gentle, a stark contrast to the rugged, dangerous man the world knew. He watched as Lucy gathered Ashley into her arms, the worn gray hoodie once again shielding the girl from the cold. As they walked away, leaving the lounge to return to its curated silence, Do-hyun remained in the booth. His second whiskey sat before him, still at the exact same level it had been when Lucy first sat down. He didn't reach for it. He simply sat in the center of his dark kingdom, staring at the empty space where a serious-eyed girl had told him the truth about his own soul. The ritual was broken, the precision of his life replaced by a chaotic, uncalculable warmth that he didn't know how to categorize. He was still the boss, still the man with the gold watch and the neck tattoo, but the obsidian walls of his world felt thinner than they had an hour ago. He sat with the silence, but for the first time in 15 years, the silence didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a question he was finally ready to answer. The golden hand of the clock in the obsidian room no longer held the absolute authority it once did over Do-hyun's life, as the rigid boundaries of his Thursday ritual began to bleed into the rest of the week. In the weeks that followed that first silent hour with Ashley, the most feared man in Chicago began to find an array of professional reasons to be present in his restaurant on non-Thursday evenings. He told his inner circle that there were supplier meetings to attend, staff reviews that required his personal oversight, and inventory discrepancies that only his sharp, focused eyes could resolve. These reasons were technically real, documented in the ledgers and discussed in hushed tones with his lieutenants, but they were also transparently something else. A thin veil of corporate necessity draped over a growing, inexplicable hunger for a different kind of presence. His tailored black suit jacket felt less like armor, and more like a costume during these extra hours, as he sat in his booth and waited for the specific shift in the room's atmosphere that signaled the arrival of a woman in a gray hoodie and a small girl clutching a tattered rabbit. Lucy had begun bringing Ashley to the restaurant for dinner on Friday evenings, a routine born of a practical necessity that Do-hyun had quietly facilitated. The noodle shop where she worked gave her a significant discount on Fridays, but it was Ashley who had made the executive decision that the man from Thursday was a person she intended to continue assessing with her serious, unblinking eyes. For Lucy, these Friday dinners were a surreal departure from the mathematical equation of her daily survival. She sat across from a man who could end lives with a whisper, yet she found herself worrying more about whether Ashley's sticky fingers would ruin his crisp white dress shirt than whether he would unleash his legendary temper. The incremental accumulation of small moments between them began to form a new kind of ledger, one where the currency was not debt or loyalty, but a shared, quiet understanding that defied the dark tones of their surroundings. Do-hyun, a man who had spent 15 years perfecting the art of controlled distance, found himself becoming a student of a 4-year-old's specific, non-negotiable world. He learned which pages of the rabbit book Ashley considered acceptable to skip when she was tired, and which ones were sacred texts that required his full, undivided attention. He practiced the third word she taught him in her private language, a soft, melodic sound that meant together, and he found that the word tasted better than the most expensive whiskey in his cellar. He watched the way her small hands moved, a mirror of the way his brother Soo-min used to gesture when he was excited, and he felt the corridor in his mind beginning to brighten with a light he hadn't realized he was allowed to keep. He wasn't just a mafia boss during these hours. He was a man learning the geography of a child's trust, a territory far more complex and dangerous than any territory he had ever seized in the city's underworld. From across the table, Lucy watched this transformation with a mixture of awe and a burgeoning, fragile sense of peace. For the first time in 2 years, she felt as though something was happening in her life that was not a problem she had to solve, a fire she had to put out, or a debt she had to calculate. She saw the way Do-hyun's furrowed brow would smooth out when Ashley corrected his pronunciation of a fictional character's name, and she saw the way his large, rugged hand would hover protectively near the edge of the table whenever Ashley leaned too far forward. It was a strange, beautiful dissonance, a predator playing protector, a ghost returning to the land of the living. She allowed herself to breathe in these moments, the $3,400 weight on her chest feeling slightly lighter, as she watched the most dangerous man in the city become an anchor for the most important thing she had ever done. However, The shadows of Lucy's world were not so easily dispelled by the soft light of a restaurant booth. The debt she carried was a living thing, a predator that didn't care about the budding humanity of a mafia boss, or the innocent assessments of a 4-year-old. The collector had not forgotten the sneakers near the door, and his patience was a resource that was rapidly running dry. On a Friday evening that had felt particularly peaceful, the reality of their struggle punctured the velvet silence of the obsidian room with the force of a gunshot. Ashley had been coloring a picture of a star, her tongue poked out in concentration, when she suddenly looked up at Do-hyun with the same level, piercing gaze she had used on their first night. Her voice was matter-of-fact, lacking the drama of an adult's fear, but carrying all of its weight, as she delivered a report that caused the air in the booth to turn to ice. "A scary man came to our door yesterday," Ashley said, her small fingers tightening around a blue crayon. "He had a loud voice, even though he wasn't shouting. He made Mama's hands shake so hard she dropped the milk." The silence that followed was different from any silence Do-hyun had ever curated. It was a cold, sharp vacuum that sucked the warmth out of the room. He didn't look at Ashley. His eyes moved immediately to Lucy, whose face had gone a ghostly, translucent pale. He saw the way she instinctively reached for her daughter, her hands indeed beginning to tremble at the mere mention of the encounter. He saw the raw, exposed terror she had been trying so hard to hide beneath the worn fabric of her gray hoodie, and he felt a familiar, lethal heat beginning to stir in the depths of his chest, the same heat that had once burned through the streets of Chicago when he was building his throne. Do-hyun didn't ask for details, and he didn't offer a platitude. His controlled posture didn't break, but his intense, focused eyes narrowed until they looked like shards of gray flint. He understood the language of scary men at doors better than anyone in the city. He knew the cadence of their threats and the specific, calculated cruelty of their timing. The fact that someone had dared to bring that shadow into the orbit of the child who taught him words of peace was an insult that required a definitive, permanent response. He looked at the gold luxury watch on his wrist, not to check the time, but to mark the exact moment his perspective shifted from curiosity to a dark, protective intent. The 1 hour was no longer a temporary arrangement. It was the foundation of a new kind of war, one where the stakes were not money or power, but the safety of a girl who thought he looked lonely. Lucy met his gaze, and for a second the predator and the mother were the only two people left in the world. She saw the neck tattoo, the sharp jawline, and the cold, calculating mind of the man the city feared. But she also saw the man who knew which pages of the rabbit book were non-negotiable. She didn't have to say a word. The shaking of her hands was the only plea he needed. Do-hyun reached out, his hand finally closing over the whiskey glass he had ignored for the last 20 minutes. He took a slow, measured sip, the amber liquid fueling the fire that was now raging behind his calm expression. The obsidian room felt smaller than ever, the dark tones pressing in like the walls of a fortress under siege. He was a man who had spent 15 years ensuring he would never be helpless again. And as he looked at the serious-eyed girl who had seen her mother tremble, he realized that the scary man at the door had made a fatal mistake. He had tried to steal the light from a man who had lived in the dark for far too long. The investigation into the man named Marcus Vale was not a matter of passion for Do-hyun, but a clinical exercise in the specific, terrifying efficiency he had perfected over 15 years of rule. To the rest of Chicago, Vale was a mid-level predator, a man who haunted the peripheries of the working class with a ledger full of predatory interest, and a smile that never reached his cold, opportunistic eyes. To Do-hyun, however, he was a variable that had dared to disturb the hard-won silence of a child's world, and such variables were always eliminated with the quiet thoroughness of a surgeon. From the corner booth of the obsidian room, Do-hyun sat with his tailored black suit jacket draped over his chair, his intense, focused eyes fixed on the digital dossier Reed had compiled within 48 hours of Ashley's matter-of-fact report. He did not need to shout to exert his will. He simply turned the pages of his internal map, identifying the rot that had dared to touch the woman in the gray hoodie and the girl who clutched a tattered rabbit. What he found was not merely a single debt of $3,400, but a deliberate, parasitic system designed to bleed the vulnerable. Marcus Vale did not just hunt, he farmed. Do-hyun's investigation revealed a pattern of cruelty that mirrored the very traps he had spent his youth avoiding. 7 other women in Lucy's neighborhood, all single mothers, all caught in the same suffocating cycle of skyrocketing interest and whispered threats. It was a mirror of the helplessness Do-hyun had felt in that hospital corridor, a systemic abuse of the light by the very darkness he had once claimed to master. He looked at the names and the figures, his sharp jawline tightening as he realized that Lucy was just one of many who had been forced to choose between the milk and the medicine. The neck tattoo against his crisp white shirt seemed to pulse with a dormant, lethal heat as he closed the file. The decision already made before the first sip of his Thursday whiskey reached his lips. He dealt with it not as a hero, but as a ghost, a man who moved through the city's veins without leaving a footprint. Do-hyun did not send men with guns to Vale's front door. That was the work of a younger, less disciplined version of himself. Instead, he utilized the layered, invisible channels of his empire to dismantle the debt from the inside out. He cleared the balances for all 8 women through a series of offshore accounts and shell companies so complex that no individual payment could ever be traced back to the man sitting in the back of an upscale bar. To the banks and the collectors, it looked like a clerical miracle or a sudden anonymous grant from a philanthropic phantom. He ensured that the legal titles to their piece were returned to them, scrubbed clean of the interest that had been eating them alive, all while maintaining the absolute distance that his life demanded. But Do-hyun knew that clearing the debt was only half of the cure. The predator itself had to be neutralized. With a few calculated phone calls and the strategically timed release of certain documents to the specific people in the district attorney's office who still possessed a shred of genuine ambition, he made Marcus Vale's entire operation visible to the light. He provided the breadcrumbs that would allow the law to dismantle the shark legally and publicly, ensuring that the man who made Lucy's hands shake would find himself in a windowless room much like the one where Do-hyun's own world had ended 15 years ago. He stepped back into the shadows once the machinery was in motion, watching from the periphery as the system he usually bypassed was used as a weapon against a man who lacked the intelligence to be truly dangerous. He did not tell Lucy what he had done. He did not call her to boast of his protection, and he did not wait for her to thank him for the miracle. He did not even calculate what she would think when the collector stopped coming, or when the letters of release arrived in her cramped mailbox. To Do-hyun, this was not an investment in a relationship or a move on a chessboard. It was a fundamental correction of a reality he could no longer tolerate. He did it simply because Ashley had looked him in the eye and told him that her mother's hands had shaken, and in the private, guarded cathedral of his soul, that was a transgression that could not be allowed to stand. He was a man who lived in the dark, but he had discovered that even the deepest shadows have a duty to protect the light that accidentally wanders into them. On the next Thursday, he sat in his usual booth, the 2 whiskeys marking the beginning and end of his ritual as they always did. The obsidian room was as quiet and curated as ever, the dark tones of the interior reflecting the controlled distance he maintained from the world. He reached into his inner jacket pocket, his thumb tracing the edge of the photograph he never displayed, but for the first time, the memory of his brother did not feel like a heavy shackle. He thought of the word Ashley had taught him, together, and he realized that his empire was finally serving a purpose that had nothing to do with blood or betrayal. He was still the boss, still the ghost who's seeking silence, but he was also the man who had ensured that a 4-year-old girl would never have to watch her mother drop the milk in fear again. He watched the door, his posture still and composed, waiting for the shift in the air that would tell him they had arrived. He knew that when Lucy walked in tonight, she would be carrying a mystery she couldn't solve, a sudden absence of the $3,400 weight that had been crushing her ribs for 8 months. He would look at her with the same intense, focused eyes, showing curiosity mixed with caution, but he would remain silent about his role in her liberation. He preferred it this way. He wanted her to believe in the miracle of her own luck, rather than the intervention of a monster. He adjusted his gold luxury watch, the symbol of a wealth that had finally bought something truly valuable. A moment of peace for a woman who had forgotten what it felt like to breathe without a tally. As the golden hand of the clock slipped past 10, Do-hyun felt a strange, unfamiliar sense of completion. He was a powerful, dangerous man who was used to control, yet in this moment, he was content to simply be the man who watched over the ritual. He took a slow, measured sip of his whiskey, the amber liquid warming him as he prepared for the next hour. The hour where he would be corrected on his pronunciation, where he would learn which pages were non-negotiable, and where he would continue to assess the soul he had almost forgotten he possessed. The obsidian room remained a world of darkness and secrets, but for one man, the shadows were no longer a place to hide. They were a place to guard the only thing that made the silence worth having. The revelation did not come from a whisper in a dark alley or a formal letter with a gold seal. It came from the laundry room of Lucy's apartment building, delivered by a neighbor whose eyes were clear for the first time in a year. The woman had mentioned, with a stunned, breathless sort of reverence, that her debt to Marcus Vale had simply vanished, dissolved into a sea of banking errors and anonymous settlements that had swept through the neighborhood like a silent, cleansing tide. Lucy had stood there, the scent of industrial detergent filling her lungs, and she had known instantly. She didn't need a paper trail to trace the source of the miracle back to the obsidian booth and the man with the gold luxury watch. The realization hadn't brought the immediate surge of relief she expected. Instead, it had brought a sharp, focused heat to her chest, a need for a different kind of accounting that had nothing to do with $3,400 and everything to do with the boundaries of her own soul. When she walked into the obsidian room that Thursday, she didn't wear the gray hoodie of a beggar or the glossy-eyed expression of a victim. She moved with a deliberate, quiet authority, stepping past the invisible security detail, as if she owned the air they breathed. She reached the corner booth where Do-hyun sat, his jet-black hair slicked back and his intense, focused eyes tracking her arrival with a curious, guarded stillness. This time, she didn't lean forward in a plea. She sat down and placed her hands flat on the polished table, her fingers spread wide and steady. The gesture was a declaration of presence, a refusal to be a ghost in his kingdom. Do-hyun lowered his whiskey glass, his sharp jawline tightening as he sensed the shift in the atmosphere. He was a man used to gratitude that looked like fear or loyalty that looked like greed, but the expression on Lucy's face was something he hadn't prepared for in his 15 years of rule. "You cleared it," she said, her voice precise and clear, cutting through the curated silence of the lounge. "Not just mine but the others. You moved through our lives like a god and wiped the slate clean without a single word." She watched the way his furrowed brow twitched, the light stubble on his face catching the dim shadows of the room. He didn't deny it. He wasn't a man who lied about his power. "I didn't do it for a thank you, Elena," he replied, his voice a low, resonant hum that vibrated against the table. But Lucy shook her head, her gaze never wavering from his. "I know why you think you did it. But I have spent 2 years building a life out of nothing. I have worked 2 jobs, skipped meals, and fought every second to ensure that the ground Ashley stands on was built by my own hands. I will not have my life reclassified as a gift. I will not have my struggle erased and replaced by your charity." She wasn't asking him to undo the miracle. She was too practical for such pride. She was asking him to understand the difference between being saved and being seen. Do-hyun listened to her, fully, with the same absolute, unhurried attention he gave to Ashley when she corrected his reading of the rabbit book. He didn't compose a rebuttal while she spoke, and he didn't reach for the armor of his status. He simply sat in the weight of her words, realizing that for all his power, he had almost committed the same sin as the man who had left her with a text message. He had treated her like a variable to be managed rather than a person with an agency he had no right to colonize. The silence between them stretched, no longer a vacuum of power, but a bridge of shared gravity. Finally, Do-hyun leaned back, his controlled posture softening for the first time since the ritual began. He looked at his second whiskey, the amber liquid a mirror of the past he had tried so hard to bury. "You want to know the truth?" he asked, his voice losing its edge of command. "It wasn't about the debt. I didn't care about the money or the man at your door, not really. I did it because of a corridor." He began to speak then, the words coming slow and heavy, like stones being pulled from a deep well. He told her about Sumin, the brother who had believed in his goodness, and the interrogation room where he had sat in handcuffs while a heart stopped beating 3 blocks away. He told her about the 15 years of building an empire as a fortress against helplessness, only to find that he had built a prison of his own making. "This booth, these 2 hours on a Thursday, it was the only way I knew how to stay connected to a person who isn't here anymore," he confessed, his eyes drifting to the empty space across the table where so many ghosts usually sat. I built all of this so I would never have to watch someone I love be destroyed while I sat uselessly in the dark. But then your daughter looked at me, a man who has spent a decade making people tremble, and she didn't see a boss or a monster. She saw a man who looked lonely. She was the first person in 15 years to be right about me out loud, Lucy. She saw the ghost inside the suit, and she wasn't afraid to touch it. Lucy's hands remained flat on the table, but the tension in her fingers began to ebb as she absorbed the raw, jagged honesty of his confession. She saw the man behind the gold luxury watch and the neck tattoo, a man who was just as trapped by his history as she was by her poverty. The Thursday ritual wasn't an ego trip, it was a wake. The protection he had offered wasn't an act of condescension, it was an act of atonement. They were two people standing in different kinds of ruins, trying to figure out how to build something that wouldn't crumble the moment the wind changed. Do-hyun looked up at her, his gray eyes searching hers for a judgment he felt he deserved. I didn't clear your debt to make you beholden to me, he whispered. I did it because for 60 minutes, you let me be something other than a ghost. You let me be the man my brother thought I was. The obsidian room felt different now, the dark tones no longer a shroud, but a canvas. Lucy realized that the man sitting across from her wasn't a god to be feared or a patron to be managed. He was a partner in a grief she understood all too well. She didn't offer a platitude, and she didn't take back her demand for respect. Instead, she reached out, her hand sliding across the polished surface until her fingers brushed the sleeve of his tailored jacket. It was a small, quiet movement, but in the history of that booth, it was a revolution. Then don't give me gifts, Do-hyun, she said, her voice softening but remaining firm. Give me your time. Sit with us. Not because we're a project, but because you're tired of being alone in the dark. As the clock on the wall slipped toward the end of the hour, the ritual reached its final, permanent transformation. The two whiskeys were still there, but the silence they marked was gone, replaced by the low, murmuring conversation of two people who had finally found a common language. Do-hyun felt the weight of the corridor lifting, the memory of Sumin finally finding a place to rest in the presence of a woman who wasn't afraid of the shadows he carried. He looked at Lucy's hands, still steady on the table, and he realized that the empire he had built wasn't the point of his life. This moment was. The 1 hour had become a lifetime, and as they sat together in the darkest corner of the city, the most feared man in Chicago finally allowed himself to stop looking at the watch and start looking at the light. The transition of power in the obsidian room was not marked by a change in the ledgers or a shift in the street-level territories, but by the quiet, ceremonial extension of a 4-year-old's approval. Ashley did not give her trust away in a single burst of childhood whimsy. She offered it in incremental, carefully considered fragments, as if she understood that the man with the neck tattoo required a specific kind of tempering before he could be fully admitted into her world. For Do-hyun, these weeks were a masterclass in a brand of diplomacy he had never encountered in the underworld. He found himself navigating the treacherous waters of playground politics and the high-stakes negotiations of nap time with the same intense, focused precision he usually reserved for his empire. He learned that Ashley's silence was not a void, but a workspace where she was constantly measuring the weight of his presence against the safety of her rabbit, Barnaby. It was a slow, beautiful erosion of the walls he had built, a process that made the tailored black suit jacket feel lighter, and the gold luxury watch feel less like a countdown to a lonely end. The morning of the full revelation began in the small, sunlight-streaked kitchen of Lucy's apartment, a space that felt impossibly bright compared to the dark tones of the restaurant. Do-hyun sat at a cramped wooden table that wobbled slightly, his large frame looking out of place among the mismatched mugs and the scent of cheap coffee. Ashley approached him with the solemnity of a high priestess, carrying Barnaby by one ear. Without a word of greeting, she began to teach him the full vocabulary of the language she had previously only shared with the stuffed rabbit. It was a melodic, rhythmic system of sounds that mapped her specific universe. A word for the way the light hit the radiator, a sound for the feeling of a new coloring book, and a complex, 3-syllable phrase that meant, the person who stays when it's dark. Do-hyun listened with a furrowed brow, his light tan complexion creasing in concentration as he repeated the sounds back to her. He didn't treat it as a game. He treated it as a secret code more valuable than any encryption his security team had ever devised. Later that afternoon, The shift from observer to participant became permanent during a quiet drive across the city. They were in the back seat of Do-hyun's car, a vehicle usually reserved for silent, high-tension transits, when the exhaustion of a long day finally pulled at Ashley's eyelids. As the city blurred past the tinted windows, she reached out and took Do-hyun's hand. Her small fingers curled around his palm, her skin a soft contrast to the rugged, slightly scarred texture of his own. He froze, his controlled posture locking into place, terrified that a single movement would break the fragile bridge she had built. He watched as she drifted into a deep, rhythmic sleep, her head resting against his tailored sleeve just as it had in the booth. When she woke up 20 minutes later, she didn't rub her eyes or ask where they were. She simply looked up at him with those serious, unblinking eyes and asked, without any preamble, "Will you come to the doctor with us tomorrow?" The question hit Do-hyun with the force of a physical blow, a direct strike to the memory of the hospital corridor he had never truly left. He felt the old, cold vacuum of the ICU hallway trying to pull him back into the past, but the warmth of Ashley's hand still lingering on his palm acted as an anchor to the present. He didn't look at Lucy, who was watching from the front seat with a fragile, hopeful stillness. He looked only at the girl who had decided he was a person who belonged in the rooms where life was decided. "Yes," he said, the word a low, resonant vow that vibrated through the quiet of the car. "I will be there." It was a simple commitment, but for a man who had built an entire kingdom to avoid being helpless in a medical waiting room, it was the most dangerous thing he had ever agreed to do. The following morning, the most feared man in Chicago sat in the plastic, beige chair of a specialist's waiting room, his knees nearly touching the low table covered in tattered children's magazines. The air smelled of that same industrial disinfectant that had haunted his nightmares for 15 years. And the mechanical hum of the building's ventilation system was a cruel echo of the machines that had once failed his brother. Beside him, Lucy sat with her hands flat on her knees, her pale, tired look replaced by a sharp, focused anxiety. Do-hyun didn't reach for his phone to check the status of his business, and he didn't signal his men to clear the room. He simply sat there, a powerful, dangerous man in a space designed for the vulnerable, feeling the full, unadulterated weight of the fear he had spent a decade trying to outrun. He realized then that the specific quality of sitting in a waiting room was not the fear of the outcome, but the agony of the wait itself. 15 years ago, he had been trapped in a cell while his brother faced the dark alone. He had built his empire so he would never be useless again, thinking that power was the antidote to the helplessness of the corridor. But as the minutes ticked past on his gold luxury watch, he understood the profound, unresolvable irony of his life. Power didn't make the waiting room any less terrifying. It didn't change the results of a blood test or the rhythm of a heart. The only thing that made the corridor bearable was the presence of the person sitting next to him. He wasn't sitting there as a mafia boss who could buy the building. He was sitting there as a man who was willing to feel the terror alongside the woman he had grown to respect. He reached out and covered Lucy's hand with his own, his touch a silent acknowledgement of the weight they were both carrying. The distinction, he understood in that sterile, brightly lit room, was everything. To be present for the fear was not a sign of weakness. It was the ultimate expression of the strength he had been searching for since the night Soo-min died. He wasn't a ghost seeking silence anymore. He was a guardian who had finally found a reason to stand in the light, even if that light revealed his own fragility. When the door finally opened, and the nurse called Ashley's name, Do-hyun stood up with a composed, unyielding grace. He didn't move toward the door with the intent to control the situation, but with the intent to support the people walking through it. He looked at Lucy, seeing the determination in her glossy eyes, and he realized that the 1 hour in the obsidian booth had led him exactly where he needed to be. As they walked into the examination room, the shadows of his past seemed to recede, replaced by the matter-of-fact reality of a 4-year-old holding her rabbit. Do-hyun took his place by the wall, a silent, powerful anchor in a room full of uncertainty. He was no longer running from the corridor. He was occupying it, transforming it from a place of loss into a place of life. The empire still waited for him outside those doors, with its blood and its betrayal and its dark tones. But for the first time in 15 years, Do-hyun knew that the most important deals weren't sealed with a nod in a private club. They were sealed in the quiet, terrifying moments of a waiting room, by the people who were brave enough to stay until the end. He watched Ashley climb onto the high table, her small voice speaking a word in her private language that meant not alone. And he finally allowed himself to believe that the ghost was gone, replaced by a man who was no longer afraid of the dark. The golden hand of the clock in the obsidian room slipped past the Roman numeral for 10, but tonight, the sound of the world did not fall away into a curated, lonely silence. 2 years had passed since the night a desperate woman in a gray hoodie had breached the sanctuary of the corner booth, and the geography of Do-hyun's world had been irrevocably remapped. The shadows were still there, draped elegantly over the dark tones of the lounge, but they no longer felt like a shroud. They felt like a velvet curtain pulled back to reveal a life he had once thought was a fiction reserved for other men. Do-hyun sat in the same booth, his tailored black suit jacket open and his gold luxury watch catching the dim light, but he was no longer a ghost seeking silence. He was a man anchored to the present by the soft, rhythmic chatter of a 6-year-old girl who had spent the last 24 months teaching him that the most powerful thing a person can do is simply stay. Ashley sat between them, her serious-eyed intensity now tempered by a bright, mischievous spark that had grown as her health stabilized. She no longer clutched the tattered rabbit, Barnaby, with the white-knuckled grip of a child waiting for the wind to blow her away. Instead, the rabbit sat propped against a water glass, an honored guest at a table where million-dollar deals had once been the only currency. With the ceremony of a girl who knew her worth, Ashley took it upon herself to order for the entire table in her private, made-up language. Do-hyun listened, responding with a reasonable fluency that had taken hundreds of hours of patient correction to achieve. Beside him, Lucy leaned in, her pale, tired look long since replaced by a vibrant, focused energy. She spoke the language too, though with an accent that Ashley found endlessly charming and technically incorrect, leading to a round of soft laughter that drifted through the lounge like music. The transition in Do-hyun's empire had been as methodical and quiet as the investigation into Marcus Vale. For 18 months, he had been stepping back from the illegal side of his organization, transferring the machinery of his power piece by piece to lieutenants he trusted. Men who understood that the city was changing and that the old blood debts were a currency that was rapidly devaluing. He was building towards something he could not have named 2 years ago. A legitimacy that didn't require a fortress of shadows to protect it. It was a slow, deliberate dismantling of the armor he had worn since the hospital corridor. A realization that he no longer needed to be a monster to ensure that no one could trap him again. He was trading his crown for a life, and the bargain felt like the first honest deal he had ever made. Lucy, too, had reclaimed the pieces of the woman she had been before the text message, and the $3,400 debt. She was in her second semester of night classes, pursuing the healthcare administration degree she had abandoned at 24 when the world had first started to crumble. Her relationship with that knowledge had been transformed by the long hours in specialist waiting rooms and the terrifying calculations of Ashley's medication. She wasn't just studying for a career, she was studying to be the person who ensured other mothers didn't have to walk into a mafia boss's lounge with a prayer in their hands. As she sat across from Do-hyun, her hands were flat on the table, steady and strong, a testament to the fact that she had not been saved, but supported in her own ascent. As the meal progressed, Ashley stopped her ordering to share a new revelation. She had recently extended her private vocabulary to include a word for the specific, rare feeling of being exactly where you are supposed to be. It was a complex, beautiful sound that captured the warmth of the booth, the taste of the food, and the safety of the 2 adults flanking her. She taught it to both of them with the gravity of a professor, her small voice filling the space where the silence of the Thursday ritual used to live. Do-hyun repeated the word, feeling the syllables settle into the hollow spaces of his chest. And he realized that the language of a child was the only one that could truly describe the peace he had found. The story of the mafia boss and the single mother did not close with a grand declaration or a cinematic vow, but with a single, quiet image that contained the weight of 15 years of grief and 2 years of hope. Do-hyun sat back, watching Ashley teach her mother the new word, and he understood that the promise he had made to Sumin in that sterile hospital corridor had finally been kept. He had promised his brother that he would not let the work consume everything that mattered, but he had spent a decade trying to fulfill that promise through discipline, control, and the careful management of distance. He had failed until the moment he said yes to an hour he could not calculate, to a request that made no sense in his world of ledgers and leverage. He had been saved not by his power, but by his willingness to let it go for 60 minutes. The moral this story carries is quiet, but it does not apologize for its simplicity. The people who see us most clearly are rarely the people we expect. A 4-year-old with a lopsided rabbit had seen through 15 years of tailored armor and cold gray eyes in 30 seconds. Not because she was extraordinary, but because she had not yet learned the adult art of looking away from what is actually there. She had seen a lonely man where the rest of the world saw a predator, and in naming that truth, she had given him the permission to change it. We spend enormous energy managing the performance of who we are, building empires and rituals to hide our fragility, yet we find our greatest strength in the moments when the performance fails. Lucy had walked into the obsidian room because she had no options left, which meant she also had no mask left to wear. She brought only the raw truth of what she needed, and the terrifying courage to ask for it from a man who had every reason to say no. That willingness to be seen in her hardest hour, to ask a stranger to sit with her child while she fought for their future, was not an act of weakness. It was the bravest thing she had ever done. And it was the catalyst for the only miracle Do-hyun had ever believed in. It was enough to bridge the gap between a mafia boss and a cleaning woman, between a ghost and a father, and between a corridor of loss and a table of light. In the end, it was everything. As they rose to leave, Do-hyun didn't look at his watch. He didn't look at the shadows. He simply took Ashley's hand and followed Lucy toward the door, leaving the 2 whiskeys untouched on the table. The obsidian room remained, but the ritual was over, replaced by a life that was finally, irrevocably real.